Hi, I'm Chunka Mui. I'm joined by my co-authors, Carroll and Tim Andrews. Let me start by saying how thrilled we are to be with you today at this very important conference. The goal of our book, A Brief History of a Perfect Future, is to explore how we can collectively take full advantage of the amazing tools and capabilities enabled by human creativity, science, and technology to fashion the world that we want for our children, and their children, and your children, and all of humanity. I can think of no better principle for guiding that work than kindness, and no better venue for discussing it than this World Youth Conference on Kindness. Youth are both the motivation for our work and the change agents who must make that work successful. So what we'd like to do in this segment is to explore some key themes from our book that relate directly to empowering our collective action to achieve many of the Sustainable Development Goals. We'll address SDG 13 in particular, climate action, because that's one of the chapters in our book. But we'll also touch on other SDGs in our discussion, which we also explore in our book. What we hope to do is to explore what each of us, both individual and collectively, can do now to help achieve one or more of those Sustainable Development Goals. What we'd like to do is start off with a key theme from our book, the laws of zero. And I'm going to ask Tim Andrews, my co-author, to briefly explain that to the audience.
The laws of zero are really about how to imagine the broad landscape of the future. Predicting the future is very difficult, especially in close details, which companies will be successful and come and go. But when we look at technologies as they advance from year to year, we can't really tell which ones are going to be the real landscape shapers, the mountains of the future that are going to be really obvious. But if we look far enough, turns out it's actually a little easier. Technology that's advancing exponentially or even any nonlinear way will dominate over a long period like 30 years. Take, for example, mobile phones. 30 years ago, mobile phones barely existed. And when they did, they were archy, large, and extraordinarily expensive, and often you couldn't get any service to make a call anyway. Today, there are billions of phones. Everybody's got one at least in their pocket in most of the world, and there's cell service almost everywhere. And in the other areas that we explore, genomics, energy, computing, and bandwidth, and so forth, we can go on to talk about how far things have come in 30 years and why these are dominant technologies. Most of the other stuff fades into the background. If you think about genetics, just 20 years ago, not 30 years ago, only 20 years ago, it was $100 million to sequence a single genome, and now it's less than $500. So we can think about the futures we can invent because we can be confident in these curves that are going to continue. They're like glacial movements. Nothing's going to stop them. And we'll have so much capability in these dominating technologies that we'll be able to think hard about what we can do to take advantage of them if we can see it. And it's hard to see because humans aren't really good at this. Again, if I told you 30 years ago that your 14K dial-up modem would seem ridiculous and that there'd be so much bandwidth available all the time, you could do pretty much anything you wanted, you might have had trouble believing it. So when I say to you now, that 30 years hence, you'll have so much more bandwidth, you won't even know what to do with it. That you'll have basically infinite bandwidth, that the cost of bandwidth today will be zero. You may struggle to start to figure that out, and you have to work at it. You have to train your imagination to try and figure out what's realistic. And this is realistic, this isn't fake. We're not dreaming pie in the sky. It's quite realistic to think in 30 years, you'll be able to sequence a genome for basically zero cost. With solar power, similarly, you could make such services available at almost no cost if you look at the cost of solar and how rapidly it's declining. You could make climate change that would be much more accurate in simulations and observations because, again, we are accumulating so much more data and the computers will have so much more power that you'll be able to have much more accurate understanding of where climate change is happening and where it's going to go in the future so that we can try and do things to prevent the worst outcomes.
That's great, Tim. Thank you. Paul, I want to give credit where credit is due. You were the originator of the law of zero concept. Anything to add to to Tim's comments?
Tim is certainly on the point. We talk in the book about how a gigabyte of memory in 1980 cost $300,000. Today it costs less than a penny. I mean, a reasonably small fraction of a penny. So it's not free, but it sort of feels like free. Back in my days covering technology for the Wall Street Journal, people were selling systems of video conferencing for $1 million or so. And now it's just tossed in as part of the computer. I mean, what we're doing now is not anything that we paid for. You buy a phone for the voice capabilities, but these days you get a photo scrapbook that's in there. You get video, you get all these other things. To me, one of the most exciting things is satellites. So I've seen a $1.5 to $2 billion satellite, this monstrous thing actually shrink wrapped in a manufacturing facility. And these days, satellites are sort of the size of a shoe, and you'll have dozens of these things sent up, maybe even hundreds at a time. And they're now to the point where they're basically scanning the world. So you talk about climate change, you can now actually every day get a snapshot of what's going on in the world and see what's happening to rivers and so forth. So it's not just a straight decrease in cost, it's that once the cost decline happens, then have a little solar, have some water, have some satellites, have whatever. And I think there's real power there.
Yeah, the one statistic that jumps out at me over and over again, especially as we grapple with this pandemic, is the cost curve on genomic sequencing, right? Over the last 20 years or so, genomic sequencing has gone 1 million times cheaper and 1 million times faster. And it's why we're able to sequence the virus so quickly and to create the vaccines from that information. So if we think back up forward 30 years and it increases another million, it's another 1 million times cheaper. What does that mean for all the things we can do in every walk of life? I want to shift gears a little bit though and talk about future histories. Because while we know that technology is progressing, we also know that technology is just a tool, right? It can be used in many ways. It can be used for good, it can be used for evil, or it can be used for nothing more than fun and mindless distraction. In our book, we offer the tool of future history as a way of mapping out narratives about how the laws of zero might be harnessed for noble purposes, such as writing a desirable future history of climate. Paul, I wonder if you could spend some time talking to the audience about what future histories are and how they might apply to climate.
Sure. So the human tendency is to sort of live in the moment. I mean, we remember things, we can project some, but as we've said, it's hard to sort of think of these things, especially when we're talking about exponential improvement. One doubling is one thing, but to double again and again and again and again, 20 times over 30 years, it's just hard to get your head around. And if we keep going, we'll have these technological capabilities in 30 years. It'll happen. The question is whether we're going to plan well enough ahead of time. And a thing that we've done, you and I together, Tim mostly separately, is to take people into the future and say, okay, let's imagine what we can do based on these capabilities, and then let's describe that world, because then people have a vision, they know what they're going to get to. You talk about climate change, and it's one thing to say there's an urgent need. Well, okay, fine. I'm eating less meat, right? I'm driving my car less. I'm doing a number of things individually, but I don't really have a sense of how they fit into the big picture. Well, the big picture is that there are about 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide that are being emitted every year, and we have to get that to net zero by 2050. So you start at that goal, and then you say, okay, this is what that world can look like. And then you work backward and say, okay, we not only need to have electric cars, but those need to have clean energy sources, and we need to have low carbon steel and no carbon cement and all these things. And you can sort of work backward from the goal that you're trying to get to and have a way of seeing, oh, it's not just enough to drive an electric car. We have to do all these other things as well.
Yeah. Tim, any other examples to along those lines to share with the audience?
Yeah. So solar power is another one that really got my attention as we were writing the book and has been for a while. It's incredible how fast solar itself has developed and other alternative sources as well, such as wind. And so these are really important examples. And again, as Chunka was saying and Paul was indicating, we know these technologies are going to be available to us. So solar is an example, again, of another technology that will be available to us. But we have to work at it to get it to work well towards the right end and in the right time frame, which around climate change is particularly important. So solar power is already, per unit, if you will, cheaper than any other form of energy today. But it's not a fair race because there's lots of existing coal and other kinds of power plants that are out there, and they need to be replaced to really cut the emissions down. And the sooner we replace them, the better. Now, we can do it today in terms of the basic trade-off of cost, but it costs money to tear down a plant and build up a new one, and it costs money to buy the fuel. And until it's cheap enough that it's literally less than buying the coal for a coal plant, people don't want to do it. So we have to take stronger action right now, but it's possible. That's the kind of future history we want to write, which is we want to get to net zero, taking advantage of solar and these other renewable energies. And if 30 years out, we want them to be in place and really cutting emissions to zero, what do we have to do 15 years from now? What do we have to do 10 years from now? What do we have to do starting right now so that we don't wait too long? And as Paul was saying, give in to our instant gratification desires, our sort of caveman desires, if you will.
Right.
So that to me is really important.
Yeah, I think solar is a great example of how even if the raw capability is there, we have to build the infrastructure around it to adopt it at a massive scale. We have to change the grid, we have to change the transmission lines, we have to change the cables, we have to make it usable on a large scale. And the thing that future histories can do is that if we can tell that narrative, we can tell that story for people to really rally around, then we can have that collective action. But if they think they can wait, they will.
There's a key point about solar as well for me that's sort of an unanswered question that we ought to be grappling with now, and that's how much needs to be connected to the grid. Because you have parts of the world that don't have an elaborate grid that can in fact just set up solar if they have some battery. And if you do that, there are all kinds of things that can happen. You have, satellite connections to the internet. You can pull water even in fact out of the air if you have enough. So there are sorts of things that can be designed now that are, conceivably connected into the grid, but are mostly separate.
Right. But the other thing that you said earlier, Paul, which is really key, is that if you start from the goal, which is 50 billion tons a year, and work backwards, you realize that there are lots of unsolved problems within those 50 billion tons, right? There's all this methane, there's the carbon emissions from creating cement and steel and plastics, and how do we capture the carbon that's in the air already? And those are unsolved problems to a large extent, at least at scale, and that's where the laws of zero come in, right? We can take advantage of the science we have today and work on the rest of the problems. Because if we just focus on solar, if we just focus on the emissions from transportation and energy, that's only a small percentage of the 50 billion tons. So we have to have that holistic view and work backwards from there. But I also want to say that while we've talked a lot about climate, the laws of zero have a tremendous impact on a number of other SDGs. Goal number 2 about ending hunger, goal number 3 about healthy living, goal number 6 about water and sanitation. All those are very much dependent on the infrastructure that we create and build around us. And the kinds of technologies that we're looking at, enabled by the laws of zero and the change over time, allow us, if we can design the right future history visions and work towards them, they give us tremendous tools for addressing those goals as well.
There's an old line about how plumbers have saved more lives than doctors have, because the quality of water matters so much. And once you have abundant electricity through solar or whatever, you can have pure water in much greater quantities than are possible today.
Yes, right. Absolutely. There's another line that you taught me that I love, which is that the best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago, and the second best time is right now. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here. But I want to shift gears and maybe come to a close for our audience and talk a little bit about, we talk in our book about, well, what do you do with the laws of zero? What do you do with future histories? And what can you start doing right now? And we talk about what governments can do and what companies can do and what individuals can do, because they're all necessary. So I thought one way we could close this session was to go through those three and talk about that. And Tim, you want to start with governments?
Sure. So governments are still going to be around, I believe, in 30 years, though no guarantees of anything at this point. But I think they will. And governments can have a really important role, both good or bad. They will have an important role. Most important thing that governments can do is set direction and convening. So they can bring parties to the table, they can invest in certain directions and encourage certain things. So in the United States, there is a lot of investment going on right now in renewables and incentives to use those renewables. Governments can regulate, but I think the most important thing is really recognizing how to make things move more quickly. So in the United States, again, since that's where we're the most familiar with, we had a program a while ago called Cars for Clunkers, where they would buy old cars just to get them off the road. Because again, cars that are run on electric will be plentiful and inexpensive in 30 years. So we'll be able to have cars that are not affecting the climate, but there'll be plenty of cars that are run on gas that still run if we don't get them off the road. And so one example that's being used today a lot is called a fee bait, where not only do they pay you to use the right things, but they penalize you to use the wrong things to try to really accelerate getting these emitting technologies out of the, in this case, off the road. So penalize people for buying gas guzzlers and incentivize them to buy clean cars. And then they can do, larger projects, but that's more difficult because it gets more political. But there's lots of things governments can do.
Yeah, and we spend a lot of time, you in particular spent a lot of time in the book talking about the various programs that the government can have. In the interest of time, I want to move to Paul and talk a little bit about companies and now close up with individuals.
Sure. I'll just add actually one thing to what Tim said, which is that government can also do a lot of the core research. So the government actually did the core work for the internet, for the global positioning system, and for the driverless cars and a whole bunch of other things. With companies, I think it's actually a no-brainer because there is so much money to be made here. I mean, imagine that you're the company that figures out low-carbon steel. Holy smokes. You figure out low-carbon cement. You figure out some of these other things that we're talking about. The other thing that we're actually starting to see now through a movement that's called ESG is that companies are finding that their customers and employees really care about their purpose. And if they just say, we're here to make as much money for shareholders as we can, that's one thing. A lot of people are happy to make money, but they also get a lot of benefit from just showing that they are responsible corporate citizens. So they can not only try to invent things on their own, but they can say, all right, we'll use nothing but green fuels for our corporate planes and so forth, and create a market for other people. So a corporation should be all in on this, and very quickly.
Absolutely. And let me just quickly close with a few thoughts on individuals. And then actually I'm going to offer our small act of kindness to close this out, this session. But governments and companies at the core are just made of individuals. All of us individually, all of you individually, all of your parents, all of your colleagues, they make up those large organizations. So individuals as citizens, as employees, as influencers, as politicians, there's a ton that you can do if you accept that the charge is that you need to affect the future, because the future is in our hands. And while we've gone through this whole discussion very quickly, what we want to offer as our act of kindness and a way to continue the conversation is our book. And we want to offer to you over the next several days 1,000 free copies of the ebook version of our book. If you go to this URL, you'll be able to get it for free. And what we'd like to do is actually offer you 2 copies. One for yourself. If you're a child, give another one to a parent. If you're a parent, give another one to your children and have the conversation about it, because only by engaging each other in these conversations can we invent a future that we can proudly leave to our kids and all kids by 2050? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.